Welcome to the Rotary Club in Milwaukee. I'm Club President Steve Chevalier, a director at Zilber Limited and at the Zilber Family Foundation. As we gather virtually today for our 14th time in our 107-year history, we'd like to continue the tradition of pledging the flag of the United States of America. Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now, Paula Pennebaker, the Chief Operations Officer for the Milwaukee DNC Host Committee, will give our invocation for today. Paula, you're muted.
Good morning, Rotarians. Today, Karen Howe will facilitate a panel discussion on the topic of racial equity. It is a timely discussion given the weeks of social unrest we have seen in reaction to the senseless, graphic deaths of U.S. citizens across the nation. While we've witnessed and addressed bad acts in reaction to the injustices, we must not be duped by the broadcast and emphasis on bad actors. Those acts serve to distract us from the entrenched racism that exists in the very soul of our nation. Martin Luther King, who we remember for his insistence on peaceful protest, did so to bring to light the hatred so many people had toward Black people. We saw that in the violence perpetuated against us then, just as we have today. In closing, Dr. King said, "We have learned to fly like birds in the air and swim in the sea like fish, but we have not learned the simple act, the art of living together as brothers," and I would add sisters. As Rotarians, we can and we must show leadership toward making a difference. Thank you.
Thank you for those important words, Paula. And also a thank you to those who helped last week when preparing and handing out COVID-19 packets for Juneteenth Day last week at the MLK Heritage Health Center. Out of an abundance of caution, we decided to postpone our in-person gathering that was tentatively planned for next Tuesday evening. We'll be sending out a survey this afternoon to kind of gauge the club's comfort level on returning to in-person events this summer. There are links to the survey in this morning's email and in our post-meeting survey email today. So please complete those so we get a feel for what our members want to do. We're also excited to announce that Rotarian Mike Paddock has written a book about his work with the Rotary Club of Milwaukee and Engineers Without Borders in Guatemala, where we've done a lot of work, and also thanks to Mike, have been very effective. He's hosting a virtual book launch party this Wednesday, June 24th at 7 p.m. There's a link in this morning's email to register for the Zoom event. Look forward to seeing you there. And this week, we're excited to welcome Margaret Hoover for our Thursday snack program at noon. Margaret is the host of PBS's Firing Line with Margaret Hoover, which is a refreshing revival of the iconic television series hosted by William F. Buckley Jr. for 33 years. Produced by WNET 13, the show brings together the brightest minds and the freshest voices from across the political spectrum to engage in a contest of ideas about important issues confronting our nation. Our appreciation to Bowden Zachary for arranging this program. Be sure to add the Zoom link in this morning's email to your calendar to catch the program live on Zoom. And on Thursday afternoon, it'll be updated on YouTube, so you can also watch it there. And finally, as a matter of housekeeping as usual, since we're doing this program in Zoom, you can put your questions or comments into the chat function, type them in, hit enter. Mary McCormick will moderate our post-presentation Q&A and attempt to get at all the questions that are submitted. And now, Karen Howe, founder and CEO of Silver Rock Consulting, will introduce our panelists for today's discussion on racial equity.
Thank you, President Steve, and welcome everyone. I think Paula gave us a wonderful invocation to remind us of the seriousness of the times we're living in and the impact that we can make. I'm pleased to announce and introduce Dr. Eve Hall, CEO of the Milwaukee Urban League, and Ed Krishok, the former Managing Director of International Legal Affairs for Harley-Davidson, as well as a former Rotary President, who are joining me today in the conversation around racial equity. Now, this conversation today, we work to make this thoughtful. It's going to be organic. And a few things I wanted to say to frame our conversation is that, one, it is going to be a conversation. Number two, it is a continuation of Rotary's work on structured racism with what we understand is something that's really pivotal and important to our community and to our society. Our intent today for this conversation is really around also highlighting what Paula said, which is, given Rotary's role in our community, it is important to raise our leadership voice around the topic of racial equity. We are intending to have a courageous conversation that's open and honest, and we invite all of us to listen and to explore. We also ask for grace if something isn't said exactly right, if we make a mistake as we speak to something. And we also recognize that our experiences will differ in how we think about something, our perspectives, and it's all based on life experiences and our circumstances. And then lastly, in terms of framing our conversation for today, as Rotarians, we invite you to consider the four-way test as you listen in and we explore what is the possibility for ending racial inequities. With that, Dr. Howe, if we could start with you, please share with us some of the conversations that you've been engaged with over the last several weeks. So we know there have been quite a few.
There have, and thanks for having me here today. And I applaud Rotary for the courage and the willingness and the interest to take this on, because in terms of the impact we have not only locally but globally, we have to endure in these types of conversations in order to be as effective as we can and to hold to the truths that we subscribe to. So what are the conversations? A number of them. So often the question is, what can we do? Whenever we're in a situation we don't have any control, that is always the first question of what is it that we can do and what is it that we can do now? There's a lot of conversation about not really understanding how deep the race issue was in this country until we witnessed what we did on social media with the death of George Floyd. It goes from those who truly did not understand the depth to those, especially in the Black community, who have seen it time and time again, and basically we're glad that it could truly be seen in terms of what has been experienced and talked about, but not always seen to that depth. The conversations I've observed are much deeper because, interestingly, when we think about the time that we're in right now, we started off with COVID, which technically stopped our entire country, our world, in a way that we've never been stopped before. And what that already did was cause us to be in more depth in terms of thinking, being with family, I think being more in touch with our own humanness, because we were all in a situation of no control to a certain degree. And so when this hit, I believe we were almost poised to receive it in a way that awakened so much of who we are. So the conversations have also led to people realizing, gosh, there's just so much more I can do with my life, or using the positions that they are in to do what they can. So that's what I've seen. I think the other has been from young people in terms of conversation, just some real questions and some fears from them. What is it going to be like for their education as they look down the road? new stories that are surfacing from especially our young men, because in the urban league, we do work with schools and the experiences that they've had and the concerns they have for their future. So those would be just as a start, some of the conversations that have occurred that I have been a part of.
Dr. Howe, quite a bit there, let me bring Ed into this conversation a little bit. And Dr. Hall, I want to key off of something you said, which is, with COVID, we had more time for reflection and to be in touch with our humanity. And so Ed, as we're thinking about these times, how have you been reflecting on what's happening in our society today?
Thanks, Karen. I've been thinking about how each of us are experiencing this moment of heightened awareness, and then also about what I can do and what we can do to live into the moment. In speaking with white friends and colleagues, we're in different places of explanation, rationalization, sympathy, shame, empathy, frustration, pain. A common initial reaction when confronted with the images that we can't deny are in front of us is, well, I'm not like that. My friends aren't like that. Racism is bad. This needs to stop. Black colleagues and friends are sharing more of their specific personal experiences of racism and experiences that are occurring on pretty much a daily basis. I realize that it's a courageous act for them to share in this way. They're making themselves vulnerable. And I'm being challenged to listen with empathy and to act. Because if I don't, the pain, the frustration, the despair, the anger that my friends are experiencing is going to deepen. And my pain and shame, because my friends are living this way on a daily basis, is going to deepen as well. And without action, we'll be missing an opportunity for progress and healing. That moment will slip away from us.
So Ed, it really sounds like you've been reflecting very deeply, and it's hit a big emotional piece. And Dr. Hall, I want to come back to you because you talked about how deep in, the piece that you just shared about how deep are these issues and what are some of the emotions that you're seeing across the range of people that you're touching?
So it's a lot of pain. It's, when I think about my, Black community, my colleagues, those that look like me, knowing that this has existed for so long, knowing that we've always had to survive in a way that's been very different than white counterparts. This has given, I think, an opportunity for us to be able to express that and for people to really listen this time. I think to Ed's point earlier, I think that there's more of an interest and intention to really understand and hear the experiences that at the end of the day, depending on the color of your skin, determines the ease in which you survive, in which you succeed in this country. As hard as it is, at the end of the day, there is often a difference in the way we are responded to by law enforcement. Not everyone, because I know that is one of the most sensitive discussions right now. But our reality is that there is always the talk that our parents have to have with our sons so that they know how to act if they get stopped so that they can live throughout the stop. That is a reality that we live with, that people don't always want to acknowledge. And I think this is given an opening to really be able to speak to it without it being diminished. I saw a very profound conversation between Joel Osteen and John Gray, both pastors in Houston. And John Gray was actually, got his experience and start with Joel Osteen. And these two men had never really talked. And they had this on TBN. And I believe it is a conversation that everyone should listen to, because it was between a Black man, a white man, and they really listened and heard each other. And it was a brave conversation, because when we speak about the spirituality and we talk about church and the religious world, that's another aspect of kind of different levels of racism and experiences that people have had. And for those two to be on national TV, to have those conversations, I thought that represented the kind of conversations that we can and should be able to have, that I believe will take this country to another level.
Dr. Hall, you're reminding me of a lot of the stories that we've been seeing, reading about, and experiencing, both directly as well as the subtleties, right? The subtleties that are intentional around what it means to have different colored skin.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's funny because, you know, I said this to someone else, you know, we all come in the world the same way. 9 months, basically, right? In the womb. But once we enter the world, things change, depending on your color, depending on your class. And this is not to say that, you know, and as I'm speaking as an African-American, that we have not had successes, that we don't have successes, you know, but it's just the journeys that we are on are different. And, you know, I can appreciate Ed even saying earlier, you know, as he's had his conversations, you know, just that difference in hearing and really being able to listen. But you know what? It's the same for us, because we have to be able to listen to you. We have to listen to you know, white individuals as well, because one of the concerns that that has come across as I've been in conversation is individuals saying, well, you know, am I supposed to now walk around feeling guilty, or how am I supposed to carry this, or this wasn't my fault, or, you know, just a real struggle with how to feel. And what I've said is, you know, this is not about you feeling guilty. It is not about you saying, well, I don't have privilege, because, you know, that's been another very touchy conversation around the quote unquote white privilege that kind of sparks things. But at the end of the day, it's really just an acknowledgement and acceptance of, we have different experiences depending on who we are in this world, and how in fact can we work together so that we can all have a just society, and where we can all have true opportunities to live a quality life.
wow, Dr. Hall, that was amazing, because one of the things I read recently was a piece around, somebody said, it was an African-American female author. She said, no one's mad at you for being white, just like no one's mad at me, in this author's voice, for being Black. The issues are how we treat each other, as well as structurally how things happen. So I think, Dr. Hall, you really gave a nice perspective that created space for all of us to engage in, to try to make things better. Ed, I want to bring you into this conversation with some of the things that Dr. Hall just shared around, and going back to where you started and entered this conversation around the pain and the shame and some of the emotions. So talk through some of the things that you've been experiencing, and how you're seeing where there's possibilities for action and activity.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that you know, pain and shame in particular has come up in a number of conversations. I was with a group this weekend and had an opportunity to hear a short Langston Hughes poem that struck that chord. You know, so we're together, and you know, in this country, we're pulling together. We want to listen to each other, hear each other, do the best we can. But there's there's this need to get over, I think, the shame of this. If I can, I'm going to read this poem quickly to see if it has the same impact on people as it did on me when I heard it. It's I Too Sing America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America.
Wow. Thank you, Ed. You know, you're reminding me, that poem reminds me that a lot of the civil rights movements of the 60s isn't that far away, because my dad, I wasn't planning on sharing this, so give me a second here. You know, as Asians, we're also people of color, but we kind of don't fit always into black and brown. We also don't always fit into the Caucasian groupings. And so my dad came over as an immigrant with literally $5 in the 2 suitcases. He was a graduate student, and he went to Auburn, Alabama, deep South in the 60s. And this poem, Ed, that you shared reminds me of a story he once told me, that he went to go eat at a diner, you know, learning English, studying for his PhD. And he saw a sign, colored people sit in the back, white people served up front. And he said to me, I didn't know where to sit. Mm-hmm. So I shared that because your poem reminded me of that. And it was hard to hear. It was hard to hear about people being served at different places, right? Because of what Dr. Hall started us off with, what we were born into. And, you know, the things we take for granted, which is kind of the piece of the privilege, right? So I just would offer that up, that it hasn't been that many generations, right? Mm-hmm. And we've made progress, but we haven't in so many respects.
Mm-hmm. And I think the pain and the shame, I was talking to my kids, my kids help to keep me on track with this, is the pain and the shame can be a trap, because a natural reaction sometimes is to try to suppress that and to not move on from it, to kind of sweep it away. And I think that in this moment we're being challenged to embrace that and to move on from that, and not to take an aspirin and feel a little better, but to dig down into the deep cause and heal. And so I hope we're able to find that, you know, that path and that conversation.
You know, when you say that, Ed, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, Ed, I love your comment about healing. Dr. Hall, you know, what are some of your thoughts, and whatever else you were about to say?
Yeah, when I hear Ed talking about, you know, healing and the pain, you know, that's so then coming from where we sit, that is such a challenge. I mean, I will tell you, I can't watch any more videos of our young men getting killed and attacked. I can't do it. It hurts when you talk about hurt, because I'm always thinking, okay, I don't have children of my own, but I have my godson, I have my nephews, you know, they're like my kids. So I always tease them. I'm like, you got all my money growing up, so you might as well have just been my kids too. But, you know, I think about them all the time, and it's like this constant worry that we always have to keep inside. It is when, you know, my friend, when he comes and I have to tell him to be careful jogging. I shouldn't have to feel concerned, but because he is 6'2", and, you know, kind of that muscular kind of guy, the stereotypical darker skinned man, jogging, I have to be concerned. And so it's those kinds of pains that, we're living through daily. I don't watch anything where I see the prisons, because I know that most of the people that are in prison are Black men. And I know that's a whole nother issue, but I can't, my heart can't take it. And then some of the movies or documentaries, again, where there is that violence against us, is just so painful. So our challenge is, sometimes people will say, well, that's in the past. Well, it's just kind of this brushing it off and thinking we can just forget it. And so our balance and our challenge is, number one, it's not gone away, it's just in a different way. But to truly realize we still are in a different day that offers us new opportunities that were not there before. Just the mere fact that we have protests that now have included Brookfield and Grafton, places we never would have imagined, all over this country in communities, non-Black communities, where many of the protesters are white protesters right in front. You have white, you have Black, Hispanic, Asian, you have multi, generations. That is for me, the hope and what brings me joy to know that there is a unity that is taking precedence, not only here, but around the country, around social justice issues.
And Eve, Dr. Hall, I would add that it's around the world. This movement is around the world.
I thought I said around the world too, but yeah.
It's amazing to see the humanity. I'll use the word you used, Dr. Hall, earlier, the humanity uniting, in London and Paris and New Zealand, and just everywhere, Canada. And it's been astounding to see.
And I appreciate your comment though. And I wanted to say thank you for sharing that comment about your father, because I would never have thought that, but I could see being perplexed, like, where do I go? That is, to me, again, that's the power of conversations and sharing stories like this, because I'm not sure we would have thought about it.
Right. Yeah, I want to mention, and then want to bring Ed back into this conversation a little bit, but, in terms of things that we're talking about experiencing, it's real, it's here. We see it ourselves. We've seen it not too distant past. Even 3 months ago, I experienced something directly, a comment around, where are you from? And really kind of being dismissed because of the color of the skin I wear. And having those conversations to qualify my to validate that I belonged in whatever the situation that I was in, which was we don't need to get into it today, but it was to be in a circle of conversation. And it was a conversation that was a board level conversation. It's like, well, I've worked hard. I think we've contributed, right? But the reason I'm bringing this up is, like, it's real. We've experienced and personally, and it's not so distant past, not only things that we're seeing on TV, but things that are tangible here in our community. Ed, what are some of your thoughts on what you're hearing and seeing?
Well, listening and hearing, even in the context of this conversation, the experiences, almost everyone will say, yeah, that's wrong. These are racist acts. Racist acts are wrong. But there's a struggle to get to the realization, I think, that it's a pattern of a lot of these acts over literally hundreds of years in the United States, if you think about it. And So a society that that's producing those acts in that continual pattern there's got to be something that's got to be addressed at a deeper level that we've got to work on. So we've got to embrace the personal experience and acknowledge that we've got to start working on something here. It's not something that's gone away. It doesn't appear to be going away. We're being now, seeing pictures of it. It's like we're trying to be reminded more and more strongly that this is happening. Eventually we're going to run out of chances, frankly, to be able to, to address it. And so, that's one, one experience of the moment that I could share.
Wow, and run out of chances. Whew, that's big. And Dr. Hall, you talked about now is the opportunity to express the concerns that we all have, and the opportunity to hear each other, and the opportunity to change. So where are you seeing the areas of greatest need for radical change, and where do you see the opportunity for sustainable change?
Well, if we look at just the equity gaps, they're in every aspect of life. I mean, it's the gap in housing, unemployment, health, education, the policing. So, I guess I would begin with the fact of where we are with the health issue right now, which unfortunately has become politicized, and it's a health issue. And, do some real deep dives, given the fact that this is not going away, and how, not anytime soon necessarily, until something is found, but taking a real good look at, how can we make some kind of movement towards, equity in healthcare or resources. We're not going to have a viable community if they're not healthy. So I think that is a huge piece for us, because of the tension between, unfortunately, police departments and communities of color. Somehow we've got to cross this bridge to just have productive dialogue on, how we can bring that back together again. There's these conversations around defunding, and one of the clarity around that is that I think when most people talk about defunding, they don't mean get rid of the police departments. We are not crazy. We all know we must have police departments, but it's around how can we reorganize that system so that there's better training, there's more conversation between communities, accountability, in all those areas that even when we think about funding, there's funding that goes towards some of the mental health services and other things that can help communities. That's some of those next steps, and the issues. They're all so high, but those are the first two that come to mind, given just what we're dealing with today.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Mary, I'm going to have you share with us a couple of questions that have come in. And I see one from President Steve. So I don't know if you want us to lead off with that one.
Well, I think I was going to save that one for a moment. There's one that kind of ties into this idea that this really may be more than an American issue, but has global components. And it's from John Frankie. And it says, would it be more productive to focus less on racism as an American sin and more on racism as a universal sin? Not as an excuse for mistreating each other, but as a path forward. To consider that the American slave owners were perhaps neither worse nor better than the African princes who built empires by enslaving defeated neighbors and selling many of these captives to the highest bidders. To consider that discrimination against those who are different or simply less powerful is not uniquely American, but a collective thread of cultural history. So this is takes us a step back without at all diminishing the pain that we have experienced in our country as a result of discrimination and racism, but to say, okay, this didn't just start here, right? This is about people. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I will make a comment unless I can wait for you to do it.
Oh, please go ahead, Dr. Holm.
Okay, so that is a very true statement in terms of the race issue being global. White people, Black people, brown people, at some point, if we look in our history, had slaves within their own communities. I believe it is important for us to acknowledge it. But I also believe that we still cannot run away from what's happening within our own country. And quite frankly, I think we have to do both. We can make statements globally to make an impact. And I think the UN, as a matter of fact, is taking on racism as an issue. But we cannot, again, diminish or dismiss how slavery impacted this country and how the 400-year system has brought us to where we are today. And that there are also other groups, not only in terms of our slavery, but there were groups such as Native Americans who were basically wiped out of here, and they were here before any of us were here. There's that aspect. And then there's the aspect when we think of Asians who were in the internment camps, if I'm saying it correctly. So again, we can't diminish because it's in our face right now. We've got to address it. But I think at the same time, given who we are as Rotarians, because our work is global, that we should be recognizing the global impact as well.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Ed?
I agree with everything that Dr. Hall said. I would add that we live in this moment now, in the United States, in Milwaukee, and while this is a global issue, we have our own American history on this and our own American present about this that we need to be diligent about addressing, while keeping, as Dr. Hall said, while keeping the broader picture in perspective. But as we're seeing, there's a lot for us to deal with right now in this moment, and an opportunity to do that.
I'll chime in on this question as well, and it won't be too different from what was already expressed, but I would say the US, in terms of our role in the world, does have some responsibility in terms of our influence on the world. It's hard to do that right now when we need to fix our own house. We need to fix our house with an eye towards how do we influence the world for good, because we do all live together in the world. And we think about, all the different facets. Dr. Hall mentioned the spiritual piece. We can talk about business and business systems and ecosystems. And we are all interdependent on each other. So I would say, big question. We do have a responsibility to the world, but right now we do need to fix our own house. And there's so many layers to that, right? So many layers of how to think about the house. So, Mary?
Right. Yes. And I think that some of the comments coming in support that as well. We have from Janan Najib, addressing injustices around the world when we have an acute problem at our doorstep tends to water down our responsibilities here in our country. U.S. ownership and the fact of being born into slavery makes us unique. And these are not, people that were captives of war. One of the other questions here that is that for some people, people that have really have lived for a number of decades and lived through the 60s, some of this seems like it's been there and hasn't moved forward. But for others, it feels like there's really a difference that's happening right now, and that what we're seeing right now has the power to stick and to really make some change. What are your thoughts, and how are you feeling about that? And if in fact we are going to make change, are there some things that you in particular would like to see us move forward within the coming weeks and months?
Ed, you want to start us off on this one, and then we'll move to Dr. Hall.
Sure. So I think societal change is built on individual change, and this moment is coming to us very forcefully. But unless we radically change ourselves and the way we engage on the subject of race and racialization and racism, we won't seize the moment. And so I guess I'll leave it there. We've got to work on ourselves and how we're meeting this time.
Well, and I think I can't pull it out exactly, but the vision statement out of Rotary International is about creating sustainable change in our communities, in our countries, and also in ourselves. So it's very consistent with who we are as Rotarians to recognize that personal reflection and change within oneself is essential to the work that we are called to do.
Dr. Hall, did you want to comment on that question?
I guess I would just add, and this really, again, I think a good follow-up to add, I've been trying to frame, since people are always asking, what are the next steps? What do we need to do? And in part of my own framework, one aspect is this requires both individual and collective efforts. It is first of us, doing our own self-examination of who we are. And we all have our own implicit biases. We all have our experiences. So how, in fact, does that impact others around us? It is looking at our sphere of influence. Where do we have a sphere of influence where we can make a difference, just as that one person? And then how do we work across to make a difference? I think today we come together, first of all, as Rotarians. So what can we as Rotarians do as a club to promote right, to promote what is true? How do we each use our individual spheres of influence, as I'm seeing different organizational and business leaders do, in terms of now prompting and launching the deep dive conversations within their own organization. So, that individual and collective, the multi-generational, multiracial conversations together, that is what I believe will begin to make that difference.
I have a few thoughts to add to this conversation. As we do a lot of work around change and transformation, we think about, how do you really affect change? And it's the power base, those in power, whatever that definition means, in the organization or the area, the community, needs to shift that power base, right? So for example, back when there were a lot of all-male universities or all-male clubs and things of that nature, they had to vote, back in the 60s and 70s, they had to vote to include women, right? And so what I'm encouraged by now is to see the various, Dr. Hall, you mentioned all the different races coming together to lend voice to this, right? So it's no longer just a Black-brown issue. It's having white protesters along with the Black protesters, et cetera. And I think that's really an important piece, and it's an important shift. It really is an important shift. So I would say that. And the other piece that I would say is, as Rotarians, we are in leadership roles, And there are moments that we will all be in moments, and we'll see moments that there are systemic things that we can influence, as well as individual perspectives and paradigms. And until we change the paradigm, it's hard to change the system. And so with that, if you see something that doesn't sit right, then address it. And there's a quote that I love, and I mean, I get it exactly right. I think it's Booker T. Washington. He said, what hurts me is not the voices, and again, it's not a direct quote, but what hurts me is not hearing it's not the voices of my enemies, but the silence of my friends.
Mm-hmm.
The silence of my friends. And so I think that's a really important piece for us to consider.
Mm-hmm.
Jalili Kohler has put something out here. It says, the question for now seems to me to be one of reparations. John Frankie's question about the universality of this problem leads to a human, spiritual, and ethical question. But the issue is what to do now. I think specific reparations for government action, specifically in housing. The Book of Color of Law documents the racial redlining. I'm sure that this is skipping around a little bit. In education, the GI Bill was set up to allow Southern states to exclude Blacks from the free university attendance, and the present tying of the schools to the property taxes, which means poor communities go to poor schools. Are there specific areas of reparation that any of the three of you see could be particularly meaningful or possible to actually move forward?
Well, I think there has to be this intentional strategy around the areas that she mentioned. Again, what's hard about this is when we look at every aspect of life, there is a gap, and it is also related to policy, education, health, home ownership, business loans for entrepreneurs. I mean, there's always a connection to some policy rule, which also connects to attitude and about how we see people again. So, it just goes back to coming to the table and identifying these areas based on where we are, and addressing them because they're so large. So you've got this combination of short-term, long-term strategies. You've got kind of the urgency versus thoughtful strategy. And so when we think about the issues we're dealing with, they're all really going to have a time frame. And I always compare it to, it was 200 days with housing, right? Here in Milwaukee, everyone kind of knows that story. But then it was a year long for segregation to end on buses from like December 1955 to December 1956. It took a year before that change could occur. So it's how long, but addressing each of these issues. I gave what comes first. That's a toss-up.
Right.
But I think just recognizing the fact we've got some work to do, and the reparations, I think, has to come in terms of policy, law, and opportunity changes.
That was a very thoughtful answer. Does anyone else want to jump in, or I can toss out one more question here? Okay, it seems like our local demonstrations are led by an army of young people who may never have taken a leadership role prior to this. How do we reach out to them and help them to accept and recognize the leadership they can bring forward right now?
Multi-level discussions once again.
That's right.
So, I'll talk about the Urban League. Tomorrow we actually have a youth community, our community roundtable, which is focused on the voices of youth. And these are, student leaders, everything from high school to college, and we will be having conversations with them. We have our young professionals, so we have conversations with them. So I think All of us are tied to young people in some way. All of us are leaders in some way. So there has to be a discussion with them and guiding them around history of leadership and anything that we can provide to them so that they can be strong and understand that their voice matters, that they are valuable, and that they have to be at the table with us, because guess what? Their minds are still nimble. And even as wonderful as we may think we are on this panel, their minds are more nimble than ours. And they will force us in ways that we're not forcing. So we have to have those different pressures.
And I'll add to this conversation in terms of the youth. You know, the policies that we're thinking about and the larger issues that we're talking about addressing will not only be started now and today and by, you know, the various generations that are in those decision-making roles, but it also will be carried out by the future. So it is important to integrate and hear the points of view and to mutually share. And I'm reminded of the concept of it's mutual mentoring. So it's the young teaching the old, just like the old, you know, so to speak, the old. None of us like to be called old, I know. The more mature,
Right, the seasoned.
yeah, mentoring the more youthful, less experienced. But I think that's really important. We see this in a lot of different realms today. We see this in digital, you know, digital spaces. So it's not too different. And I think it's an opportunity to really co-create, to really think about what's important to the different generations and to take that to heart. And there are ways that can be very actionable that comes out of that.
And when you think about history, Karen and everybody, it was the young people that did it, right? You think about the university demonstrations, you think about even, you know, the famous lunch counter at Woolworths in North Carolina, the college students. I mean, that's the history. It's young people that really rise, you know, to the occasion. So.
And one of our greatest hopes for systemic sustainable change is this next cohort asserting itself, and we have to let them, and we have to encourage them. That's going to carry the future.
Well, I think we're just about out of time, but I'll just share one other perhaps hopeful note here, which is that Barbara Kopak Hill says there's a call to action happening in Burlington, petitioning the school board to begin a task force to develop systemic curriculum in the schools and training for all employees to combat racism. Beginning with the children in mind is a good start. And that she says that Rethinking Schools, a Milwaukee-based organization, has already developed some wonderful curriculum to start bringing these ideas in a very meaningful and powerful way to the children that we are attempting to educate. So Karen, Eve, and Ed, please. Oh,
Mary, if I could, I'm sorry. Before we close out, since we have just a couple minutes, I would love for Eve and Ed to share one maybe key takeaway that they would like to make sure the Rotarians have for today. And if I have time, I actually have a story that I want to share, a personal story. Again, something I wasn't necessarily prepared to share, but something to give us hope, and it's about school systems. So just very quickly.
I can start quickly. And
Okay.
So yeah, I would, in terms of, you know, what we can do. So if I'm witnessing something wrong happening that I've got the ability to stop and I don't do anything about it, then I'm complicit in that, no matter how pure my heart is. And so I'd like to urge us as a Rotary Club not to be complicit in allowing this status quo to just continue. We've got the ability to drive change in ourselves and in the community. We need to talk about racism, including structural and institutional racism, with open hearts, with open minds, and we need to be prepared to learn and to change. As our understanding and our empathy deepens, we need to take clear action in small ways and in big ways to break the pattern. It could be as simple as, there was a question earlier, what can I do as a white person? If you're in a conversation and somebody says or does something that's racist, got to call it out on the spot. It's a small way to start. we've got the ability to change in small ways and in big ways if we put our hearts to it and our minds to it.
Great. Dr. Hall?
So I would say, just going back to just acknowledging, as hard as it is, that racism, the differences do exist, and just all of us owning it. But then secondly is understanding the power of one, that as individuals, there's so much we can do in those conversations, as Ed's speaking about, all of us in different situations. I can do the same, but also understanding that it is about using the platforms that we're in that make a difference, and to collectively move forward as a Rotary.
I'll end with a quick story about my own upbringing. I went to a public high school, and this was a deep South. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. It was a inner city, central city high school, and we were a chartered school. So I'm just giving you context so you understand the situation. So we were roughly about 40% Black. We were about 40%, white, and about the 20% other. And what was really amazing about this was a combination of, high academics, so there's honors and AP classes, as well as local VOTEC kinds of curriculum. So we had a range of social economic classes. We had a range of race. We had a range of dispersion around the geography from the city. And what was really fantastic is that we all coexisted so well together. It was, we were all in the hallways together. We all played on the same team together, the football teams, the homecoming courts. We ran for student body together. And we had people going to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Cornell, as well as folks who may not have continued on to school, folks going to the local community college. And so that's just something that I wanted to share. And this is a public school in Memphis, Tennessee. And it is possible. And that was a really amazing experience. Like we didn't even think about race. We just worked together. We lived together. We knew kind of different classes people took, different clubs they were part of. So I just want to leave us with that as a picture of hope that can exist out there, because it does in some places, even though we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Thank you, Karen.
With
so
that,
Steve. I'll turn it back to President Steve.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that important and brave conversation. As member Mike Robertson has told me many times, if Rotary can help to eliminate polio in the world, we can certainly do something about racism in our community. A couple of quick announcements. Rotary and the Florentine Opera are co-hosting the Quarantine Opera Book Club this Wednesday at 5 p.m. Cocktail items are provided. This week they're going to be talking about The Daughter of the Regiment by Donizetti. If you'd like to join, email Michelle or visit the link in this morning's email. Those are quite fun. Also, the Rotary Club of Milwaukee is partnering again with the Milwaukee Press Club and WisPolitics.com for a newsmaker luncheon this Friday, June 26th. Republican Senator Ron Johnson will field questions from a panel of journalists moderated by Gene Miller, the Press Club president. These are wonderful programs. They're well worth watching. Contact Michelle in our office if you'd like more information about signing up. Next week is the changing of the guard. The year has gone by, tempus fugit, as the Romans used to say. It'll be our final Rotary program for this fiscal year, so please join us for that. Thanks for joining me today for this conversation. Let's go out and do some good in the world this week. Remember to try to stay safe and smart as we reopen the community. This meeting is adjourned.